Make some noise, good and loud, when our leaders fill the crowd. Don't throw your hands up, don't disappear. Better to stand up and give your reps a real ear. For once you start, you'll look smart. Practice brings polish and poise. Step up and show up, and chances will go up that you'll make some noise. Make some noise, large amounts. We the people ought to count. Corporate clout buys voters and laws. We need an outcry to get these fatal flaws amended. Join the group, join the troops, fighting to overcome boys. Sign up and show up, and chances will go up that we'll make some noise. Sign up and show up, and chances will go up that we'll make some noise. In the Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission Supreme Court case of 2010, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 in favor of Citizens United, establishing the principles that corporations have the same constitutional rights as human beings and free speech is money. Opposition to the rulings included political opponents Barack Obama and John McCain, and Ambassador Janez Lenarchik in Europe's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. Bipartisan opposition and controversy has raged the 9 years since, but to date, only one organization has presented an amendment that would overturn both principles, and that is We the People. Please welcome Paul Lowenstein and Leo Immonen to Barry's Place. You guys introduce yourselves?
Sure. My name is Paul Lowenstein. I live in Sharon, Massachusetts. I'm a retired business owner, and I spend most of my time working on towards a 28th constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United.
And I'm Leo Immonen. I live in Rentham, Massachusetts. I'm a retired high school math and computer science teacher, and I enjoy contributing to our society by volunteering for We the People, Massachusetts.
Good. How did you guys become political activists?
Well, I guess I'll go first. As I said, I'm a retired business owner, and when I retired, I needed something to do, so I volunteered for the local water committee, and I quickly realized that water is an essential, something we can't do without, but we only have one source of water. You don't get to pick your vendor on water. There's just one system, and it's the Sharon Water Department. And because it's not a competitive situation, it requires citizen involvement to make sure that the system is run efficiently and effectively. So I became more aware of how collective decisions are made about things that affect us all that we can't leave to the private sector. And that led me into this issue of, well, what about other collective decisions? How do we run our government? And I finally came to the conclusion that we have a serious problem with our democracy and we need a constitutional amendment to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess I've always been involved as an activist. My life has been a life of service. I was a Army officer, and then I taught for 35 years, and I've been involved in my local community. I've been serving on a Conservation Commission for 19 years, and I'm actually Zoning Board of Appeals for 19 years, and I'm currently finishing my 11th year in the Conservation Commission. And I retired 11 years ago, and the question is, what do I do next with my life? And I got advice from many people, says, be careful, don't overload yourselves. So I kind of waited and looked. And I'm a progressive person by nature. And there were many issues in our society that just crying out for help. And I went to a program in Attleboro Public Library put on by Lee Kettleson, who was the one of the founding members of We the People Massachusetts. And she asked me to join, and I was very reluctant to make a commitment, and I put it off for maybe a year and a half. Then finally there was an offering for a training, and I went to the training and realized, you know what, this is it. This is what I've been looking for, because I had read books about this over 20 years ago, and I realized this is exactly what I want to do, because this is kind of a basis for a solution to so many other problems. So,
Why We the People instead of other organizations?
We the People has the best amendment. Other organizations are backing other amendments, and some other organizations are also backing the same amendment that We the People is backing. But when I, like Leo, when I went shopping for an issue or a group to work on this democracy issue, I was attracted to We the People Massachusetts because of the amendment that they support, which I think is the only amendment that would really effectively solve the problem that we're trying to solve, namely get our democracy working for the people instead of powerful special interests.
Mm-hmm. And for me, it wasn't a matter of shopping for an organization to join. It was a matter, that was the thing that was closest to my heart. Mm-hmm. I mean, 20 years ago, I picked up a couple books, one called The Elite Consensus, When Corporations Wield the Constitution. This was a book written by the Program for Corporations, Law, and Constitution. I get that wrong. Anyhow, it described the problem very accurately, and I realized this really is necessary. Another book I read was also by the same group, Defying Corporations, Defining Corporations, Defining Corporate Democracy. This is by the Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy. So I always had a sense that this is an issue so big that needed to be addressed, but I didn't know how to go about it. And then when I learned about We the People, I realized I have a home. I have a vehicle that can address my very deep-seated concern that I have to move forward on. So it was like I found it. It found me. Mm-hmm. I wasn't searching for it.
What are your roles in We the People?
Leo and I kind of work together. We visited every single one of the offices in the State House, and there are 200 of them, more than once. We go in on a semi-regular basis and spend the day in the State House and talk to people, mostly aides and staff, and try to educate them on why we need to pass the We the People Act in Massachusetts. That's one of our roles. And we also work on, there's a ballot question number 2, which was passed last November, which set up a commission, a citizens commission, to come up with recommendations on how Massachusetts should respond to this situation and how we can move forward with the 28th Amendment. So we've been involved in gathering signatures to get that on the ballot, for example. There's also, now that it's set up, I've submitted my own application to be on the commission. Whether they choose me or not remains to be seen, but even if they don't, I'll communicate with them, go to the hearings and talk to them, and try to influence them to think the way I think about this. And the third area is, of course, communicating with our congressmen in Washington. People like, my congressman is Joe Kennedy, and we met with him and convinced him to co-sponsor the We the People Amendment. So those are some examples of 3 different sort of theaters of operation that we work: the state, the commission, and the federal Congress, to try to figure out some way to elevate this issue high enough that it gets acted upon.
And actually, Paul and I have been leaders in our local communities. In our organization, we have 7 different chapters based geographically around the state. Paul is from Sharon. I'm from a group based in Norfolk. And so we're kind of the leaders of those groups that meet monthly and go ahead and organize things. And Paul and I also have joined together and been accepted the position as legislative coordinators for our organization. So we go ahead and talk with the other groups and work out ways that we can go ahead and move forward. And things in the legislative campaign we do is make sure that we keep reaching out to find constituents who talk to the legislators, either on the phone or send an email or go to a meeting, whatever way. We also make sure that we have regular communications with the legislators and they understand what the issues are, what the background is. Then we have other training sessions for the legislators, bring in some experts, have a seminar in the State House, have them listen to that. And then we also go ahead and arrange to have any sort of community organization who are willing to let us come and speak. Like coming here to speak with you, Barry, this is a treat for me to be able to share my viewpoints. My wife gets tired of listening to me talking at home. So it's nice to listen to a fresh face. So thank you, Barry.
Your wife is not 100 viewers, she's one person as well.
Yeah. Besides that, she's heard it once before, more than once before.
Yes.
So anyway, we can go ahead and share, Paul and I work on ways to go ahead and get the legislature to move forward in our actions.
And I'd just like to add one other part, and that is we go out and make presentations to entities such as Democratic town committees, other organizations, League of Women Voters, for example, and educate people who are politically active about this issue to try to leverage our time. We've created a pretty good PowerPoint, I would say, that we can deliver, and we've got it tailored to different time links, so if someone only has 10 minutes for us, we give them the short version, and et cetera. So we've done dozens of presentations around a lot of parts of mostly eastern Massachusetts, because that's where we live, but you know, we go all over the place and make these presentations.
You can make a short one for our viewers right now. Okay. Could you explain to our viewers how corporate money influences things like elections and laws that are passed?
Well, one good example is guns. We're losing about 40,000, almost 40,000, maybe 38,000 Americans a year to gun violence. And it's very difficult to pass common sense gun regulations because of the NRA, despite the fact that the heavy majority of Americans, including a heavy majority of NRA members themselves, support background checks, for example. No fly, no buy. There's a number of different kinds of...
No fly, no buy. Explain, please.
No fly, no buy means if you're not allowed to fly on an airplane because of your background, you shouldn't be allowed to buy a gun either.
Okay.
That's what that means. And so the fact is that the NRA is able to make large contributions to politicians so that they can get reelected. So when the issue comes up, should we pass some kind of a regulation on guns, a politician has to ask himself, do I want to stick my neck out or and get a well-funded opponent in the next election, or you know, should I just back off and go along, get along to go along? And often it's the latter course of action that they take. So there's one example. I don't know, would you like to offer another example, Leo? I've got a few more, but I don't want to monopolize.
We have to do 10, but sure, another one's welcome.
Okay, the question is, how does the money influence the situation?
How does money influence elections? How does money influence legislation?
Okay.
You can even go back to how did it influence the Supreme Court's decision that started all this, but pick something.
One thing I would like to empathize is with our federal legislators, particularly our federal ones. They go to Congress, to the Senate, with the very best intentions of serving their constituents. They really want to do a good job. And they're people who have the ability to communicate, they can express themselves, they're able to listen to others. Yet when they walk into Congress the very first day, they get their orientation and they say, oh, by the way, at noon, for the next 4 hours, you're going to go across the street off of government property and you're going to start dialing to go ahead and ask donations to go ahead and get reelected in 2 years or 4 years or 6 years. And to me, that must be terribly demeaning. Here you've just won a congressional or a Senate election, and suddenly you're told to be a prostitute to money to go ahead and just get elected. And they're in a bind because they really want to serve their people. They have the greatest ideals in person. However, they also realize they don't do anything good if they don't stay in office and allow some things to develop. And therefore, they're stuck in the bind where they have to, because of the corrupted system, had to go out and get more money. So the politicians, I can empathize the position they're in, and it's up to us to go ahead and change the system so they can serve the way they wanted to when they got elected.
I'd just like to add one other example. Leo and I are both environmentalists. Leo's on the Conservation Commission, and I belong to some environmental groups, and we're both very concerned about climate change. And I think most of your listeners will understand that, you know, climate change is real, and it's caused by we humans with our emissions from burning fossil fuels. The question is, what should we do about it? And the answer that we're coming up with in Washington is, let's give billions of dollars in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. Well, that's like committing mass suicide. I mean, it's crazy. Why should we be subsidizing a profitable industry in the first place, regardless of the environmental consequences, but in particular with the threat of, the existential threat of climate change that we're facing? The last thing we should be doing is subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. And yet we do this. And the reason is because the fossil fuel industry, being very profitable, has enormous financial resources and can part with tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to influence our political system without breaking a sweat. And they get back in return, you know, like tens of billions of dollars. So the return on investment is absolutely phenomenal. And that's why they do it. That's the way the system is built. And we have to rethink the way our system is built, or just, you know, drive the car off the cliff and commit mass suicide by, like, lemmings or something, because we don't have the spine to go in there and fix the system. And so that's a choice we have to make. And another example, you know, I think a pretty important example, it should be of concern to every human being, is how can we rearrange our system to change the incentives so that we can make progress to transition rapidly to a clean energy economy. So.
How is the We the People amendment different from other amendments that are out there trying to address the issue of dark money in politics?
Paul, let's split this up. Let me explain the amendment, and you describe an alternative, okay? All right. The We the People amendment basically has three categories. First category is corporations should not be afforded the protections of the Constitution of the United States that you and I as ordinary people are. The reason this is important is they have used what I would call a corporate veto. Our legislators pass laws for our health, for our safety, and our welfare. And by using some constitutional protection, they go ahead and veto the law and break it. We can talk more about that later. A second portion is that money cannot, in my mind, ever be construed as free speech. And therefore, since money isn't free speech, our government shall regulate financial campaign funding. Our Supreme Court thinks otherwise. And the third one is the Constitution of the United States, this amendment would not infringe upon the free press in any manner or fashion. The free press is important. We must have information, and we can have people spouting very conservative sides, very liberal sides, but have the ability to make that platform and make the presentation to the people. So those are the three things. Corporations reducing their power in terms of protection from the Constitution. Two, we will regulate campaign financing, and we protect the freedom of the press. All right, Paul, now I understand there are some other alternatives that we don't think are the best solution to the problem we have. Could you describe one of those?
Sure. Some of the other amendment proposals would allow campaign finance reform, but they would not require it. And the We the People amendment, the HJR 48, the one that we prefer, has the word shall in there instead of the word may. So it requires Congress to set campaign contribution limits so that we all have a more or less equal voice in political affairs. Right now, if you don't have, if you can't write a check for $1 million, you really don't have a voice in Washington. Only the select few, the 0.1% of Americans who can afford to, or corporations that can give large amounts of money, really have a voice to influence public policy. And many of the other amendments that are out there just would not require that. And you have to ask yourself, well, if we allow campaign finance reform, what chance is there that a Congress that's bought and paid for would actually implement campaign finance reforms with real teeth that would actually change the system in the way that we need to change it? And if the answer is Congress needs to be required to do it and not just allowed to do it, then we need an amendment like HJR 48, the We the People amendment. So.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us some examples of how legislation that has been bought and paid for conflicts with majority views?
Could I turn that question around a little bit?
Okay, we'll see what you got. Try it.
The way I like to do is turn around is how has judicial action overturned laws passed by Congress? For example, I'm a retired teacher. I've worked with kids almost my whole life, and it's very valuable and dear to me, and I enjoy the work, and to me it's very important that our children understand how to do things. Well, back in 1998, here in the Commonwealth, we passed a law saying that you could not have tobacco advertising within 1,000 feet of a school or a playground. And to me, that made eminent sense. Why would we want to expose them to this when we're trying to educate them the proper way to live? Well, it turns out the Philip Morris Company thought this was wrong. They said, wait a minute, as a corporate citizen, person, we should have the right to be able to advertise and tell people about the product that we are going to try to sell. So it went to the state Supreme Court. The state said, no, that's fine, that law stands. They then appealed it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, you're right. You've infringed upon the constitutional rights of this tobacco company. They should be able to advertise. And so they overturned our law passed by our legislators for our children because of the constitutional rights, allegedly, of this personhood of this corporation. And that is where I take umbrage, where I think this is just not right. We have to be able to govern ourselves.
And I'd offer another example, and that is health care. We the people, through our elected representatives in Congress, passed a law called the Affordable Care Act that tried to address the glaring problem that we have in America of millions of Americans not having access to health care because they can't afford it. And the thing about it was, when that bill was being debated and put forth, that the health insurance industry made sure that single payer or Medicare for all were not on the table. Now, this is something that clearly the majority of Americans wanted because we managed to pass the Affordable Care Act. And they recognized the problem of millions of Americans being unable to access health care. And yet, this powerful lobby, the healthcare insurance industry, was able to make sure we didn't go too far to wreck their business model by having health care for all, or Medicare for all, in spite of the fact that if you look at dozens of other civilized, developed countries, European countries, almost all of which have either single payer or some kind of health care where you just go, if you get sick, you go down and get medical treatment. You don't pay for it. You pay for it through your taxes. It's a different way of paying for it. Their cost of health care is approximately half of what it costs an American on average, and yet their life expectancy is longer. Their system is clearly working better than ours, and yet we can't even consider it because of money in politics.
What are the objections to the We the People amendment and the We the People movement?
Let me take that, Paul, first.
Sure.
Here in the Commonwealth, we have been trying to pass the We the People Act. The purpose of that act is to have our legislature make a request to Congress to go ahead and propose an amendment. Okay, so we realize historically all amendments to the Constitution have been proposed by Congress, and we anticipate that will happen again. However, under the Constitution, it has a provision. There's two ways of proposing amendments. Either Congress does it, or it can be done by means of a limited amendment proposing convention called by the states for the purpose of proposing an amendment. Not to amend the Constitution, just to propose it. Okay, so our particular bill within the state legislature is requesting them to go ahead and say, Congress, act. And Congress, if you don't act within 6 months, okay, you've had enough time. Now we're making every formal request for an amendment, limited amendment proposing convention. Now that is a stickler. It has never happened in our history. We've never had a convention. And I personally believe it will not happen. Congress will go ahead and move forward once they see the writings on the wall, we need to move forward. The majority of the amendments to the Constitution have had this process started by states requesting a convention. However, there are people today who say, if we have a convention, this convention will, because of the extremists that exist in our country today, particularly in the far right, they fear they will take hold of that convention and rewrite the Constitution, wipe out all our Bill of Rights protections, change the ratification process. In other words, they believe they will flagrantly violate the law and violate the Constitution of the United States. That's despite all the learned research that has been done by our Congress, by the Justice Department, and say, no, you can have a convention limited to one specific topic. So this fear that this convention might occur, again, I say might occur, is what causes some people within the state to object to the bill we have in our state legislature.
And I'd like to add, Leo's addressed the objections to the process by which we propose amendments. I'd like to address the substance of the amendment itself. There are people and organizations such as the ACLU, I might say, who are in favor of the Citizens United decision, who believe that money should be a form of speech and that any constraint on money in politics is a violation of the First Amendment and would constrain people's ability to express their opinions. The problem we have is when you open it wide open like that, most people who can't afford to pay to play don't have a voice at all. And so how do we achieve some kind of balance, or how do we give every citizen, supposedly this is a great experiment in self-government. That means we the people, all of us, not just the 1%, but all of us. If we allow the super rich to control the political system, we really have undermined democracy in a fundamental and major way that just violates, I think, Abraham Lincoln's concept of government of the people, by the people, for the people. And he was talking about all the people, not the 1%, I would venture to guess. The most revered president of all time and his most famous speech of all time. Government of, by, and for the people. This is what we're striving for. And our history has been a history of moving in that direction. But getting back to the objection is that some people feel that money should not be money in politics should not be constrained in any way, because they say more money equals more speech, more news. You have to pay for time on TV, and yet the message that we get is the message that those who can afford to pay for it want us to hear, and not a balanced spectrum of opinions.
And I believe
May I comment? He talked about the what the amendment actually says. He talked about the free speech part. I'd like to speak a little bit about the corporations not having constitutional rights. People don't like the idea of restricting things. However, I would like to make clear, we are in favor of corporations maintaining business as usual. They should be able to enter into contracts. They should be able to go to courts and have things adjudicated. What I object to is they're using constitutional rights to wipe out or overrule laws passed by a legislature. That is the problem when those laws are passed for our good. We should not have our government determined by a judiciary doing things in behavior of corporations as opposed to people. So we need to have a balance. We need to have corporate law. It's well established. It's been here for centuries. We're just objecting to the use of the Constitution to prevent our government from protecting us.
I might point out that the ACLU allows people to air their political views for public education without charging them to do it.
It's a balance here. I mean, we have to decide, are we going to have a democracy that actually works for the benefit of the people, or are we going to have some kind of perverted idea of democracy where only those who have large amounts of money can really influence the policy making? There's a well-known study called the Princeton study, which was done by a political science professor from Princeton named Martin Gillens, and in collaboration with a political science professor named Ben Page from Northwestern University. And together they looked at almost 1,800 policy initiatives over a 20-year time period. And they classified each one of these policy decisions according to, is this for the benefit of everybody, like a public interest law, or is this something that is really benefiting the affluent? And the conclusion they came to was that the average American has virtually, whatever the majority of Americans want, has almost no influence on the probability of whether a bill will pass. What does govern whether the bill will pass is the opinion of the top 10% of wage earners. That's how they called them, the economic elites, and that's how they defined them, the top 10%. And what they found was a strong correlation between what the economic elites want and what kind of laws are passed, and no correlation with the general public and their preferences. So there's some good science behind this that shows that our democracy really isn't working. A government of, by, and for the people is not a reality today. And we need to change the system in order to make our democracy work so that everybody's vote counts. It's supposed to be one person, one vote, not $1 million, one vote. And we need to get back to that if we want our democracy to work, and if we want the people to have faith in the government that arises from the system, the rules that we set up. If the government if our elected leaders are asking themselves what's good for the country instead of what's good for my biggest donor, you know, we may not agree with the answer they come up with, but at least they're asking the right question in the first place. So that's where the democracy, you know, it's messy. I think Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government, except all the others. And it is cumbersome and messy and controversial and contentious. That's the nature of democracy. But I'd rather have that than a dictator telling me what to do, or an oligarchy telling me what to do and determining the policies that affect me as an American citizen. I'm very uncomfortable with the current state of affairs, and that's why I do what I do.
What is the track record of grassroots movements having an effect?
We have 19 states have called for an amendment, have called on Congress to propose an amendment to overturn Citizens United. That came from the 80% or so of Americans on both the left and the right. Republicans and Democrats, both heavy majorities, believe that Citizens United was wrong, and we need to get the corrupting influence of big money out of politics. So because of that, 19 states, that's a lot of states, have passed formal resolutions politely asking Congress to pretty please propose the amount we need. Of course, nothing's happened. Congress has not responded to that, and I would attribute that to the influence of money in politics. In addition, but that's something we, the people, have accomplished. At least we've elevated the issue to that extent. We've also gotten 5 states, Vermont, California, Illinois, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, have all passed resolutions to up the ante to say, okay, Congress, you didn't listen to us when we politely asked you to propose the amendment we need. We're going to call for an amendment proposing convention. That was done because of citizen shoe leather, people like Leo and me, and people like us in other states who have gone out there and worked on their state legislature and managed to get these resolutions passed. Another thing that we've accomplished, we got over 100,000 signatures on the ballot question number 2 last November that established the Citizen Commission to look into this and make a recommendation by the end of this year. So that commission is in the process of being constituted. So there are 3 examples of a difference that ordinary people getting active have made to actually move the ball down the field towards the goal line. We haven't got to the goal yet. You know, obviously it's a heavy lift, and it's going to take a lot more effort to get a constitutional amendment. I mean, that's a big deal. We've only got 27 of them in our whole two plus centuries of existence. Getting another one is going to be tough. But on average, we've gotten one every generation, and this is the great challenge of our generation, to rise up as we the people, get off the couch, turn off the TV, get to work, and get this amendment passed so that we can retake control of our own destiny with these, as I mentioned before, the existential threat of climate change. 38,000 Americans dying every year needlessly from gun violence. I mean, other countries don't have this kind of carnage, and it's because they're able to pass common sense gun laws. They just don't have guns. They're not an armed camp like the United States. They have better health care systems because the government is working for the people, not for powerful special interests.
You know, we've been a country for over 200 years. Look back at the ability of women to get the vote. That was individual people who did not even have the vote to be able to persevere decade after decade after decade until they got the ability to become full citizens and stop the absurdity of women being second-class citizens. And equally important is the civil rights movement. Over 100 years ago, we had enslaved people, and for another 100 years, they were being treated as second-class citizens. It wasn't until President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act that they finally got the rights that they should have been entitled to for the previous 100 years. And even today, they still are second class in many regards. And that's because of individual grassroots people, individual people talking and fighting and pushing forward. And so, yeah, there are some big movements that have started from the grassroots. It wasn't started by somebody at the top saying, I need to make this right for the people down below. It was the people down below saying, we don't have any power, but together we have power.
And I'd just like to point out that the examples that Leo cited, if you look back at American history, you will see that it was anti-democratic Supreme Court decisions that were overturned by constitutional amendments. In the case of slavery, it was Dred Scott legitimized and upheld the idea of slavery in 1857. We had to fight a bloody civil war and pass 3 constitutional amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, to give former slaves, make them citizens like the rest of us. And then it was a Supreme Court decision in 1937 that that legitimized poll taxes, which were a blatant effort to disenfranchise black voters and poor white voters, anyone without means. And that was
Explain the poll tax.
The poll tax means you have to pay money to vote. And a lot of people couldn't
wouldn't
afford
even think of that today.
to pay money.
But that
to
was
vote.
the rule.
Yeah, and it was wonderful for the rich people who wanted to get reelected because, you know, it made the opposition much weaker. A lot of people couldn't afford to vote. So the 24th Amendment in 1964 overturned the Supreme Court decision in the case of the poll tax. As far as women having the right to vote, 1875, the Supreme Court decided, incredibly, after the 14th Amendment in 1868 said equal protection of the laws for all. And a woman named Virginia Minor said, oh, I get it, equal protection, that means me, I'm a citizen. She marched down to knowing what would happen. She tried to register to vote, and they, of course, turned her away. She went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, In 1875, no, Virginia minor, you do not have the right to vote, because nowhere in the Constitution does it say women have the right to vote. I mean, and it took 45 more years for women to get a constitutional amendment, the 19th Amendment, which gave them, in 1920, which gave them the right to vote. And another example, in the Vietnam War, we had 18-year-olds over there in Vietnam fighting and dying for their country. And the Supreme Court ruled in 1970 that those underage soldiers between 18 and 21 years old should not be, they could vote in federal elections, but not state and local elections. Huh? They're fighting and dying for the country. What do you mean? You can't inhibit their right to vote on any level. And it took less than a year. In 1971, we proposed and ratified the 26th Amendment that gave 18-year-olds the right to vote. That was such a no-brainer, and yet the Supreme Court got it wrong, and all those examples. And now, with Citizens United, the Supreme Court has gotten it wrong again. They have said, they have opened the floodgates to the corrupting influence of big money in politics without any consideration as to what that might do to our democracy and how that might disenfranchise people who don't have $1 million to buy influence in Washington. So, you know, we're going backwards again. We're bucking the tide of American history with Citizens United, and we the people need to recognize that and get up and fight for a constitutional amendment to give each of us, one person, one vote, give each of us an equal say in how our government is run.
Yeah.
Barry, I have to tell you, it's a treat for me to be sitting here next to Paul. I am a retired person, and I'm having more and more difficulty day by day remembering things. I can remember broad strokes, but this man has an encyclopedic memory, and the ability to pull these details truly impresses me each time I sit here beside him. So, Paul, thanks for being here with me.
Well, the admiration is mutual, Leo. I mean, we work together. Sometimes I forget stuff and Leo remembers, and he forgets stuff and I remember. And together, two heads are better than one. So.
Yes, teamwork.
Yeah.
Speaking of teamwork, what are the benefits of membership for We the People? For you personally?
Let me take that one first. To me, it's so important to be involved in something much bigger than me. I have many friends who have retired, and they want to retire. They want to enjoy themselves. And they look after their grandchildren, and they go on trips. All good things, all worthwhile things. But the satisfaction I get in being involved in something far bigger than me, it just tremendously makes my life valuable. I mean, to know that I'm trying to maintain the ability of our government and our country to survive under the threats, and I feel the threats of people looking at the short-term quarterly profits with disregard to our environment, to our safety, our people. So to be involved with this bigger cause, bigger calling, it just makes my life valuable. And besides the fact, working with other people like Paul and others who are equally committed, it's just the camaraderie and the support and the reinforcement that we get. And also for me, as an educator, it's so nice to continue my education, continue to learn more. My field was math and computer science. Now I'm learning history, I'm learning sociology, I'm learning psychology, I'm learning economics, I'm learning government, I'm learning how to deal with people. And so to me, there's this growth opportunity that I have and ability, and also working with younger members. We work with a group called WestfordCAT. Many of their members are in their 20s and 30s. And it's so nice to have a cross-generational mingling working forward to making our country survive and strong again. So I just find it just a tremendous opportunity to be alive again and grow. And it's just tremendous to be part of.
And from my point of view, when I was a kid, I remember reading a child's book about a fable about a tailor, I think it was, who had a fly swatter, and and there were flies, and he swatted them, and he killed 7 in one blow. That was and he was so excited. Oh, I got 7 in one blow. And he actually embroidered it on his belt and was walking around, and he heard that the king had a problem with these 7 big ogres, and he needed to get rid of these ogres because they were causing all kinds of trouble. And long story short, the tailor volunteered because he had confidence that if he could kill 7 flies in one blow, he could kill those 7 ogres. And in the end, of course, he kills the ogres somehow. I don't remember the details. But when I retired from the business, you know, I joined the water committee, and I started to work on water conservation. And it took 10 years, but we reduced the water use in my hometown of Sharon by 30%, about 200 million gallons of water saved per year. And it had all kinds of ancillary benefits in terms of costs and in terms of reducing carbon emissions, because our town water is heavy, and the wells that lift the water out are one of our biggest electricity uses in town, and we keep 100 tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere every year just because we conserve water. Nobody's experienced any hardship because of this. We use more efficient plumbing fixtures, and we get the same benefits, so we get to use the water. We just don't waste it as much. So having had that experience of success, like the tailor with his 7 in one blow, now I think I can amend the Constitution. But and I do think, I think as Margaret Mead says something to the effect, I don't know if you remember the exact quote, Leo, but
You're asking me to remember?
Yeah, asking you.
Weren't you listening?
Margaret
He must
Mead,
have forgotten.
Margaret Mead said something like, you know, a small band of people, of dedicated volunteers can change the world, and then she goes on to say, indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So with that in mind, you know, I just believe that, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we could amend the Constitution? Imagine that. Because really, what's interesting here is that, as I said earlier, 80% of Americans believe that we need to overturn Citizens United with a constitutional amendment, and they're right about that. The problem is that 90% of Americans don't think it's possible. And this is where the 7 in one blow come in. You know, it takes, and where Margaret Mead, you know, a small group of real dedicated volunteers working hard on this can indeed accomplish it. In fact, we must accomplish it if we care about our children and grandchildren, leaving them with a world that is democratic and environmentally sustainable. These are values that I grew up with that I want to pass along to the next generation, but we've let it slip through our fingers, and before I die, I'm going to do everything I can to make things right for my children and grandchildren and their, you know, great-grandchildren, etc. We really need to live up to the example that has been set by our ancestors who fought and died for these principles, starting with the Revolutionary War and the Boston Tea Party. I mean, people have risked their lives. I think it was Ben Franklin said, we hang together or we hang separately. I mean, he really meant hanging by a rope from the neck. And it was going to cost, if they didn't win that Revolutionary War, there were going to be a lot of patriots that hung from a scaffold. And we don't have that risk today. All we got to do is get involved and take part in this great enterprise of amending the Constitution to live up to Lincoln's vision of government of, by, and for the people, which I will incidentally mention that he uttered those words standing on the blood-soaked battlefield at Gettysburg. Imagine sacrifice. We don't have to dodge bullets today, but we do have to get involved and do what we can if we really want to go to our grave with the satisfaction that we did whatever we could. Maybe we don't get that. Maybe I drop dead tomorrow. I don't know. But I'm going to do the best I can with whatever days I have left to achieve this. And if, you know, likelihood it'll happen after I'm gone. But at least...
Oh, no.
Well,
much sooner than that.
Well,
You know his doctor?
nobody knows. Nobody knows. But all I know is I'm going to keep trying as long as I can to make things right, because I've had a good life. You know, I don't have any particular financial worries anymore. I've got it made, and I can slide into the grave. But that doesn't mean I don't have an obligation to pass the baton, the same baton that I received from my parents and grandparents, and pass it along to the next generation. So,
Is the support for this limited to any political ideology, party?
it tends to be associated with liberal Democrats, but I think that's unfortunate because polls show that 80% of Republicans also support a constitutional amendment. Again, we can disagree on the issues, but we should be able to agree on the system by which we make collective decisions. And that system should be uncorrupted by big money, and most people across the political spectrum subscribe to that. With a few exceptions, most people believe that money in politics is a bad thing.
Uh-huh. And what state is the legislative move at this point?
Right now, I would say we are gaining supporters in each legislative session. Our state legislature is known for being one of the more deliberate legislators. They tend to let things go year after year. They like to go ahead and vet them fully and make sure they understood and looked at all ramifications of things before they take action. And as they gain more comfort, things get more likely to occur. It was encouraging in January when we went around the State House speaking to various staff members. When we mentioned, I am a volunteer for We the People of Massachusetts, they said, oh yes, we know who you are, we know what you are for. So we are now a known quantity, and our supporters are growing each time, and we need to continue to advance that. We know in our State House, it tends to be, particularly in the House, a very top-heavy decision-making situation. So we need to build grassroots support within the State House so that we can go ahead and have the leaders say, yes, this is where our members wish to go.
What can our viewers do, those who aren't involved yet?
There are all sorts of opportunities, and each person decides for themselves how much time they want to put in. We have frequently times when we ask people to go ahead and call their state rep or state senator or their congressperson or one of their federal senators, or write an email to them. The important thing is our legislators do respond to constituent contacts. If we don't tell them what we want, how will they ever know? Are we going to allow them only to listen to moneyed interest, people who are paid to give them advice? We can't let our democracy go so easily. Furthermore, people can go ahead and write letters to the editor, go ahead and talk to their neighbors, share their viewpoints, come to a meeting of ours, or join our mailing list, or come to the State House when there is, in fact, a public hearing on our bill. Or if they wish, sometimes actually go into the State House and talk to the rep in person. Or get involved with a group of people and have a meeting together with their legislators. Our legislators also many times have monthly meetings.
In the district?
In the district. And I've been told, my own representative, that when I was there, this was his 6th year in office, and he says, you're the 7th person to show up. And I was like, wait a minute, where are the citizens of Massachusetts? We must care about something that we need to tell our state representative about. And therefore, each person to their own in terms of what they can contribute. But it's a wide opening, and it's a matter of deciding where you fit in and come and try it for a while. And if it doesn't work somewhere else, try a different place. But there are openings, just a matter of, we would love to have more volunteers because this is not an easy process. We know worldwide, the ability to amend the Constitution of the United States is one of the hardest things to do. Yet, we realize it's not going to be done unless I help out, you help out, and others help out. It needs to be a concerted effort in whatever fashion works for you.
Great.
I'd just like to add that We the People of Massachusetts has 7 chapters so far. I didn't have one in my town, so I started one, and I would encourage everyone to try to find out where their closest chapter is, and if it's not close enough, start your own. It's not hard to do. You can get a free room at the library once a month and see who shows up. You know, we'll help. We have a database of people who have signed petitions, and we can, if you were, say, in Northampton or some town or Westford, if you don't have a local chapter in your local area, we can give you a list of everybody who's signed petitions from our database, and that would be, you could call them up. You know, we give you the phone numbers, you can call them up. They've expressed interest in our issue, or send them an email. If they didn't give the phone number, maybe their email is there. You can contact them and try to make a core group. Maybe you go to your local Democratic town committee or your Republican town committee and say, are you interested in this? Maybe you join the Republican town committee and Democratic town committee, whichever your preference, and get involved in issues and bring this issue up with them. That's another way, because town committees, political town committees, tend to have a disproportional influence on their legislators, because they're the ones that are standing out holding the signs, and the legislator knows it, so he's going to listen to what those people say. So get involved, get active. And there are also two other groups in Massachusetts, in addition to We the People Massachusetts. There's American Promise, which is headquartered in Concord. There's WolfPAC, which is a national group, but they have a chapter in Massachusetts, and we actually collaborate with all these people. We aren't parochial about this particular. We want to get the amendment. And if some other group is working towards the same amendment, we're working as partners. We've jointly lobbied in the State House with volunteers from WolfPAC, for example, and we helped American Promise. They're the ones that initiated this Citizen Commission thing, and we gathered signatures for them. So we work together collaboratively to try to move the ball down the field towards the goal line.
Great. Any last statements?
Yeah, just like the way to contact us is through our webpage.
Good.
www.wethepeoplemass.org. No spaces.
We'll print it.
www.wethepeoplemass.org.
Great.
And I would add, too, if you want to educate yourself more about the issue, a couple years ago, I worked with our local cable TV station in Sharon to create a YouTube video called Fixing Our Broken Democracy. And if you Google Fixing Our Broken Democracy, you should be able to find it pretty quickly, especially if you add my last name, Lauenstein, which is hard to spell, but it starts with L-A-U. So if you type Fixing Our Broken Democracy, L-A-U on Google, you would find it immediately on YouTube. It's 36 minutes, gives you the historical context for how we got into this situation and what we need to do to get out.
We'll caption that too.
Okay, great.
Good. Paul and Leo, thank you so much. And I hope you, the viewers, enjoyed this show and will help us make some noise. See you next time.